Here, we show various versions of the key passing puzzle so we can contrast them. Here, we show various versions of the key passing puzzle so we can contrast them. This is the version of the puzzle that's present in the released game, but the solution is even more obvious here because the key is in a small area with a wall to the right, so the only possible way the key could go is to the left. In the actual game, the key is located next to the rabbit distraction puzzle where you can keep running to the right a little bit, and I did this intentionally to create a little more uncertainty about where to go with the key. You solve this puzzle by jumping across the pit so that the key almost makes it to the other side, but then you rewind and let your shadow do the jump while you stand in the proper place to receive the key. To solve the puzzle, you have to start your jump very close to the edge of the platform, which is a negative to me. I would like it if the puzzle gave you a lot more slack in terms of where to jump, which is part of a philosophy discussed over here. But if you as the designer size the pit so that the player can successfully jump from further back, then a more experienced player could instead run up to the very edge and jump and make it across the pit alive, which ruins the entire puzzle. So the pit cannot be very narrow. But even with a pit that you can't jump across, we still have the problem that because the key has to get far enough that you can grab it later, you have to be able to almost jump across. And this violates one of the core principles of puzzle design we mentioned in the link above, which is that if you aren't supposed to be able to jump across a gap, it should be clear that you can't do it to avoid player fumbling and frustration. You shouldn't even come close to making that jump, but you have to for the puzzle to work. To help mitigate this situation, I made the left side of the pit higher than the right. Now, when you attempt to jump, at the far side your feet are well below where they need to be to successfully land, so it's more clear that you just can't do it. But because the key is held higher than foot level, it still ends up in a good place. But I can't make the left side too high, otherwise it lets the player jump from the left to the right, which I also didn't want, because this makes the solution a little too obvious or trivial feeling. After all, if you just jumped over the pit to grab the key, of course you're going to try to jump right back. Also, in order for the puzzle to work well, when you do it wrong and jump into the pit and die, the key needs to fall to a position where the live player can no longer reach it. Otherwise, the timing element of the puzzle would be gone because you could grab the key anytime after the shadow jumps into the spikes. Getting the key more easily would not only make the puzzle less interesting to solve, it would sap drama and gravitas, because these are much stronger when the about-to-die Tim desperately passes the key to the alive Tim. In order for this key passing to work at all, a rule had to be specified in the gameplay code. If the shadow Tim is holding a key that's shared among both realities, and the live Tim intersects with that key, the live Tim takes possession from the shadow Tim. Because the game is a simulation that should respond deterministically to all events that could happen in its world, the game must have some consistent rule about what happens in this case, but as the designer, you get to decide what that rule is. Maybe a more natural rule would be that whoever was already holding the key keeps it. But I wanted this specific puzzle to work, so I made the rule the way it is now. You could think of this extra rule as being a tiny blemish on the puzzle design, but given that the active reality already feels more important than the shadow reality, this rule may seem unsurprising to the player if he thinks clearly about it at all, which most players won't. The idea for this level is that you need to bounce off this monster's head in order to get across this gap, but you probably killed the monster on the way up, so by the time you get to this platform here and can't figure out a way up, there is no longer a monster down there that you can see as a clue to what you should do. So the jump just seems plainly impossible. Suppose we're designing this level, how wide should we make this gap? This is an important decision with lots of nuances. Obviously, the gap needs to be wider than you can get just by jumping, because if it isn't, you can just jump across so there's no puzzle. How much wider should it be? One answer is barely wider so that it feels like you could almost jump across, but can't quite. You might imagine this to be a way of teasing the player, like, oh, you're so close. But there are problems with doing this. Firstly, as a designer, you have to always keep in mind that players don't know what you know. They're always at least a little more confused about everything. When they get to a level like this, they're not even sure there is a puzzle. If you give them a jump that they could almost make, the player's confusion is not going to be, aha, I cannot make the jump. This is a puzzle where I must figure out some other way across. Much more likely, he'll think, I almost made it. Maybe I jumped too early off that platform. Maybe if I run to the very edge and jump at the very last instant, I might be able to make it. And then this doesn't work. But the player knows his timing might still have been off, and this is an earlier level in the game, so he isn't super familiar with the timings and distances yet. So he'll try again and again, and maybe each try will take longer than you want, because even though rewind is in the game, it is quite common for people missing this jump to run all the way back to the left, climb the ladder, run to the right, and try again, because they aren't used to using rewind to correct non-deadly mistakes. So there would be some tedious attempts, and then the player is getting frustrated before starting to take seriously that there may be some other way to do it, and this starts things off on the wrong foot emotionally. Instead of a narrow gap, you might go for a super wide gap. Make the gap the maximum length you could travel by bouncing off the monster's head. You might think this would be good, because upon first sight, the player knows he just isn't going to jump that gap normally. Or even if he makes one jump attempt, that is certainly enough. He didn't come anywhere close to making it, so he won't have this frustrating experience of trying repeatedly that we just described. But maybe too much certainty is bad. There's not a whole lot you can do in this game, so maybe we're making the puzzle too obvious if the player knows on first sight he absolutely cannot jump that gap. Maybe the wide gap will attract so much attention that he will see the problem earlier, maybe much earlier, before he kills the important monster. But a bigger problem with a maximum wide gap is execution skill. Ignoring any idea of trying to get up to the ledge, it's already a bit hard just to jump down and hit the moving monster below. If the gap is extremely wide, you would need to perform that bounce when the monster is at exactly the maximal extent of your jump, which greatly limits the range of situations in which you can be successful, and timing must be very, very precise. You'd end up in a situation where a lot of players might be trying the right solution, but this is the first version of the key passing puzzle that I thought of and implemented in the game. It's simple, and it doesn't require the somewhat precise jumping of the final version. Instead, you just pass the key through the little hole in the wall. But I didn't like it because it seems so obvious and contrived. Obvious because the hole grabs so much attention. I need to get this key from one side of the wall to the other, and what else would such a hole be for? When you solve the puzzle, it can't really feel magical because obviously that weird hole is there so you could put the key through it. Whereas there are spike pits elsewhere in the game, so that pit's very existence didn't raise attention. That it seemed too contrived is a bit of a different thing than being obvious, but it's not totally unrelated. Because there are no small holes in thin walls elsewhere in the game, it's like we're adding a new concept into the level geometry that the player needs to recognize, but just for this puzzle, and we'll never see it elsewhere. I try to avoid this kind of thing in my designs because when you do this a lot, it makes the game feel weighted down and ugly. Here's a version of key passing where you can give the key to a monster who takes it through the tunnel for you. This is less weird than the previous version because such monster tunnels already exist throughout the game. This version of the puzzle seems too easy to solve by mistake, though. If your shadow is holding the key and accidentally gets killed by the monster, the key will naturally end up on the other side of the tunnel without you intending that to happen at all. When the player experiences an accidental puzzle solve, it can confuse him and reduce his confidence that the makers of the game have him in good hands, which can have consequences down the road. To decrease the odds of an accidental solve, here I've put extra monsters atop the various platforms to help put the player in the mood to stomp monsters. Because if the player casually stomps the monster that would have In the interview with Mark, we talked about separating this high jump puzzle into its own level to decrease confusion and to increase focus. This is what that might look like. And I think this version might have made the original game better. But the game as a whole consists of many levels with multiple puzzles on them and only a few levels with single puzzles. If I change this level to have only one puzzle, it would shift the game further in the direction of single puzzle levels, which would change how the game feels overall. But you could do that. You could imagine redesigning the whole game to have one puzzle per level. The result would feel pretty different, I think. Some puzzles would be easier due to increased clarity and focus, and that's probably good. But the game would also feel more like other generic puzzle games, which often have one puzzle per level. And some other basic functional things about the game would get uglier. For example, on the cloud screens, we would need to have a big row of 12 doors every time. Mark suggested making the puzzle easier by hinting that you need to make a monster bounce off your head. Here's the idea I came up with during that discussion. It works, but it's pretty ugly because of the weird geometry and the way the player is almost trapped on the left side of the level. In the rest of the game, you can just walk to the next level anytime you're stuck, except, of course, in the boss levels, where being locked in is part of the drama. So locking the player in here on a normal level is really not great. Not only because we're blocking the player's ability to experiment, but because we're diluting the uniqueness of the boss levels. One way that puzzle games end up being mediocre is when designers make stuff like this and just decide, hey, it's good enough. To really produce high-quality work, you want to notice ugliness like this when it happens, to see all this weighty stuff has been added to the level, just to make an excuse to bounce a monster, and then ask yourself, can't I find a more elegant way to do this? Then you could try different ideas in your mind or in the level editor and judge to yourself whether they're becoming uglier or more beautiful. Every good puzzle designer I know practiced it. After making the previous level, I was dissatisfied with its ugliness. Remember that the goal was just a hint at the high jump solution by having you bounce a monster off your head. I worked on the level further and came up with this version, which provides a much simpler reason to do such a bounce. I think this version is obviously much better than the ugly one, but if I were to choose, I still like the first revision better, the single screen puzzle that has no hints. One problem that I see sometimes with Hunt is that people get up to the platform on the left here, and they've already killed the monster below as expected, so there's no visual sign of the right way to get across to the right. But there's a monster here on the platform with them. Or if they killed it already, as soon as they rewind, that monster is the first one resurrected. So a player might spend a long time trying to bounce off this monster as it walks over to the right side of the platform, because it's the only obvious possibility for solving the puzzle. The jump doesn't come anywhere close to getting you across, and you do bump your head on the ceiling for reasons explained here. So this approach can't work, but a player is likely to try several times, frustratingly, before trying something else, because there simply is no visual cue of any other way up there. Maybe that's fine. I thought so at the time. Hey, it's a hard puzzle, let people be a bit stuck. But now I wish I had encouraged players to be stuck in a cleaner way. The cleanest revision to try as a designer might be just to delete this monster so that the platform is empty. This messes up a subtle bit of symmetry of the level, that there's exactly one monster on every walkable surface, but it's probably worth it. But removing this monster would somewhat ruin the World 4 version of Hunt. You could bring back that monster only in World 4. Or you could do what I've done here, split this platform so that the monster still exists, but doesn't come anywhere near the gap you need to cross. This removes one major avenue of frustrating wrong attempts, which is maybe good. It makes the level easier, which is maybe bad. If you bounce off this monster's head, starting from somewhere on its own platform, it seems almost like you can reach the platform on the upper right where you're trying to get. Tim's arm gets to about the middle of that platform. As far as I'm concerned, that's a bit too close, and I'd like a way to fix that. We might try to move the platform you're standing on further left, but we can't because you'd have to move it so far that the actual good jump that solves the puzzle becomes impossible or nearly so. You might notice that the third floor of this puzzle is quite expansive compared to the first and second floors, and say, hey, why didn't you just move the third floor upward a bit, shrinking the height of that level and expanding the height of the second floor so the place you're trying to get is clearly too high. But the problem with that is, in the natural process of solving the puzzle, the player will kill the first 3 monsters and keep trying to jump off the 4th one to cross the gap, and I wanted the player to feel like he has plenty of room to jump around, not bumping his head on the ceiling all the time, because that would make the experience of trying to solve this puzzle more frustrating. Being physically blocked all the time or bumped around when things are already going badly can be mildly rage-inducing. That said, the ceiling right above the gap is a bit lower than the ceiling to its left in order to provide wider puzzle tolerances to make it more obvious that this is not the right solution. So the player does bump his head here, just not very much, and hopefully not in a frustrating way. The top row also needs space because you want enough room for the player to jump and not leave the top of the screen. And the HUD is up there, and it gets awkward if the HUD is covering your gameplay. We could have added more space and caused the screen to scroll vertically, but this level is just much better when you can see the whole thing at once. So, even though I was not happy with how high the player can bounce from this monster, I didn't see any solution that wasn't worse than the problem, so I left it as is.